This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. We will start with a question from Jackie from Switzerland. Are you aware of any species where low-ranking males, either individually or as a group, punish females for rejecting their mating advances?
Yes, this turns out to be a common primate motif, actually common in all sorts of social species, and makes often for a pretty grim story. All right, for hundreds of thousands of years, if you asked primatologists about mating systems, mating access in primate species that were tournament species, polygamous, polyandrous, multiple males, multiple females, male dominance hierarchy, it was a very simple answer as to what mating was about. And this was called the linear access model. If there was one female only in the troop who was in estrus and heat ovulating, she would wind up with the alpha male. If there were two females in estrus, it would be males 1 and 2 in the hierarchy, 3 females, 1, 2, 3, and so on down the line. In other words, mating, who females mated with, completely determined by male dominance rankings. And then something interesting happened late 60s, 70s or so, where somehow suddenly all the best primatologists were female. And they started looking at this, and what they discovered was this linear access model, in fact, was not very accurate at determining paternity, who actually mated with who. It wasn't actually one female, number one gets her, two females, numbers 1 and 2 males get them, and so on down the line, completely a function of male control. And what they began to figure out was females had a fair amount of control as to who they mated with. Now, if you're a baboon, females are about half the size as males. Males have big, huge canines, a sexually dimorphic tournament species, harking back to many episodes ago. And what you would see is a female in estrus winds up in a consortship with the highest ranking available male, a consortship. The two of them are together around the clock, typically during the time of her peak swelling when she's most likely to be ovulating, and he follows her around, or in some cases, he herds her towards him away from other animals. So what does it look like when a female is exerting this thing that came, this radical notion that came to be called female choice? What would she do? She's with this male, and suppose he's like some Schwarzenegger lummox, and she doesn't want to be there, and she's got a guy she's really interested in. And what happens every time he attempts to mate with her? She walks away. He tries again. She walks away over and over, which can prove sort of exhausting for the male. Or he and she are walking around the savannah and they settle down someplace and are clearly getting ready for some sort of picnic there. And she picks up and moves away. And not only does she move away, she moves right over to this male's worst rival on the planet. So our guy grabs the picnic basket and has to run over and is all agitated and sits down with her again. And then she walks over to his first rival again and again. And in the first case, what you have is the male just gets worn down and at some point gives up on the consortship. In the second case, the male is soon in a bloody fight with his worst rival. And what the female does at that point is run away to the bushes where the guy she's actually interested in is hanging out, and all sorts of terms given in the business for stolen copulations. So this is great. This is great. And as soon as this became apparent, there was this mammoth question in the field when you would get a female who would manipulate things so that the guy she's stuck with is fighting over there, and she goes and runs to the guy on the bushes, and the question becomes, what do females want? And this is very tentative, many decades into this sort of research. It's not completely clear, but it's probably fair to summarize it as saying females want to hang out with male baboons who are nice to them. Oh my God, are they sure? Yes, nice to them, groom them a lot, help out with their kid, will carry the kid around while the female goes and forages. If the male's in a rotten mood, he takes it out on somebody else smaller and weaker rather than her. This is a prince you bring home to meet your parents. So we have this pattern of females having some control over who they're actually winding up with, female choice. But this brings us now the issue implicit in that question, which is so a female is exercising these versions of female choice and getting the male all frazzled and stuff. And what often happens is instead of the male going off and fighting with the other guy as she has planned, he spins around and bites the crap out of the female. When you look at male baboons, the most common form of aggression they have is male-male aggression built around sexual competition. The second most common form is males taking it out on females who are frustrating them in terms of mating. So this can wind up being pretty severe. A number of females of mine over the years were killed from bites that turned septic, things of that sort. So what we can see here is males who are sexually frustrated are very often dangerous males in all sorts of primate species. So that's a pattern that's found in a lot of these tournament primate species. But there's an even more striking example, one that is totally weird and unique and has an even grimmer punchline. And this has to do with the orangutan. Orangutans, apes like chimps and gorillas and gibbons and orangutans living in Indonesia. Totally interesting animals, desperately endangered at this point, smart. They make tools, which people were initially skeptical about. So the orangutan social system is rather odd. It's rather unique, which is what people initially called it was they're solitary. You get a female living in the rainforest, maybe with her kid. You get a male living alone a mile away in the rainforest. They're scattered all over the place. They seem to be the most unsocial primates on Earth. And it was the work of one of the pioneers of primatology, the trimates, the three women pioneers, Jane Goodall with chimps, Diane Fossey with gorillas, and Baruti Galdikas with orangs. And she was the one who instead got people thinking orangs give these long calls, these vocalizations you can hear miles away, which affects each other's behaviors. Long calls from a male could make a female a mile away more likely to ovulate. What she brought in was the notion that, in fact, orangutans are very social. They are just widely dispersed, but they're going about their sociality in terms of sound, vocalizations. All right, so this sets us up for now looking at this bizarrity of orangutans. So you go out and you study them in the wild, and there's females and there's males, and the males who most catch your attention are these big, massive males with phalanges, they're called, on the sides of their faces, and they've got long red hair, and they're enormous. And so these are your typical orang males who get the most attention, who are dominant, who are doing the mating when they encounter females. And then people early on in orang field work noted that there'd be these other males, sort of subadult, adolescent, whatever, little skinny, puny, squirrely guys who kind of avoided the big males. And it was totally obvious that this was the juvenile, the adolescent form of males. Skinny, scrawny, still bigger than the females, but this is someone who come back in 3 years and he's going to look like one of the big, gigantic, high-ranking males. But then people noticed something interesting, and this was from zoo populations of orangutans, where you'd have a social group and you'd have the big, dominant secondary sexual characteristic male, and there'd be one or two of these transitional adolescent guys. And the zookeepers began to notice these adolescents stayed adolescent for years, For decades, this wasn't a maturational stage because if the alpha died, went away, whatever, fairly rapidly over the next few months, the most dominant of the little twerpy guys would suddenly turn into one of these big secondary sexual characteristic males. Whoa, they're not adolescents. They are being maturationally arrested. They are being frozen in place in this pre adult form. And what's that about? And people immediately had an obvious interpretation, which was they're being stressed out of their minds by these dominant males in each of their group. And enough stress, and you disrupt growth, you disrupt sexual physiology, you delay puberty onset in some population. This could be what's going on. They're obviously being stressed into arrested development. And about 20 years ago, I had a sort of collaborative grad student, also with Duke University, named Anne Magencalda, who was studying captive orangutans and was very interested in these arrested development, stressed out of their minds, twerpy guys. She got blood samples from them. We were analyzing hormone levels, and it was totally obvious what the prediction was going to be. These guys were going to have stress hormones, glucocorticoids, cortisol, through the roof, and their testosterone levels were going to be hugely suppressed by all the stress. And that's the picture of a highly stressed organism whose development, whose sexual maturation is going to be arrested in species after species. So she got the blood samples, and whoa, that's not what turned out at all. Instead, these guys didn't have particularly elevated stress hormone levels, no higher than the big scary guys. And they had testosterone levels not through the roof, but certainly in the range of being reproductive. So suddenly, one is considering, instead of these being stressed out of their minds, infertile guys, this is an alternative mating strategy. An alternative with someone who, in addition to not being particularly stressed, is fertile. And eventually that was shown to be the case with sperm count and things like that. These guys are undercover. Now, what we just heard from the baboons before is if you were one of these orangs and you were doing it like twerpy low-ranking baboons do, what you would do is you'd be hiding in the bushes and you'd be a nice guy who's getting along with this female. And as soon as she gets rid of that lug, she comes running over to you. That's not the heartwarming scenario that's seen among orangs. Instead, something far more disturbing, which is something that's been documented in captive orangs and wild population of orangs, both in Borneo and Sumatra, which is these sexually fertile, reproductively active guys under the radar leap out, attack females, and coercively mate with them. And there's all sorts of human words that are plenty loaded and are extended to animals only with a great deal of caution. I think this counts as a very legitimate translation of the human concept of rape. These males taking this alternative strategy, what their reproductive success turns out to be driven by is not being nice guys who the females pick out, but instead by raping. And that seems to be the story with orangutans.
Now, as sort of the other end of that spectrum, Conrad from Poland asks, do you know whether primates are stargazing at night?
Well, after this grim male baboon orangutan story just now, thank God we're now getting to look at something much more cheerful. Do they stargaze at night? Do they write haikus? Do they make little bits of sculptures out of twigs? Are they aesthetically sensitive? No evidence that there's any non-human primates out there that stargaze at night. However, the things they do at night can be very interesting at times. Now, Baboons, savanna baboons, live out in the savannah, and they're out all day in the open. They're eating and grooming and doing, and they have a grove of trees that they return to each night. And at dusk, they climb up the trees and they settle in. And baboons have these gunmetal gray callosity calluses on their butts, which are like impenetrable. I have bounced blowgun darts off of baboon callosities without the guy even noticing. Thick, which they settle down and then they sleep for the night there. They sleep up in the trees because that decreases the likelihood that they're going to be predated by a leopard somewhere during the night. Okay, so that's what baboons would do. And you hang out with them all day, and at the end of the day, they go up the trees, and the next morning you see them come down. And sometimes something interesting would have happened during the night. Dusk, they're heading on up, and there's a coalition, an estrus female and a male, and they climb up the tree, and you head on out, and you see them the next morning, and the female comes down the tree with a different male. Whoa, something went on during the night. And particularly interesting is if a little while later, yesterday's consorting male comes down with an injury. Aha, there was a fight up in the trees last night and the consortship shifted. Or you could see a pair goes up the trees in the evening, and the next morning they come down, and soon afterward comes one of the rivals of this male coming down, and he's injured. Ah, they had a fight of that sort. And then every now and then you see a consortship pair go up in the trees, and the next morning the female comes down and the male doesn't come down, and he's nowhere to be seen. And you go walking around in the stream bed and you find he was killed during the night and he's lying there, what's left of him. So one thing that goes on during the night is all sorts of social machinations of reproductive strategy stuff. The other thing, far cheerier, is the baboons go up the tree and the next morning they all come down and somebody's got a newborn. Baboons always give birth at night, and there's a very strong circadian bias in all primates to give birth at night. That's very good in terms of those leopards, all that. So you knew she was pregnant, you knew she was kind of getting close. You can tell coloration thing. And she comes down and whoa, she had the baby last night. So those are the things that you can infer. I got some direct information at one point. There was a stage where I decided to camp underneath the trees of one of my troops so I could kind of see what they were up to at night. And all of this revolved around one of my all-time favorite baboons, a male who was kind of disheveled. He would yawn and his jaw would not quite go back in place, and he'd have to readjust it. And he was always bumbling into the middle of a fight of some guy looking to displace aggression. And he was constantly sitting down on poison ants or thorns, and he was kind of bumbling about. Now, there's a vocalization that male baboons give when they want to know where everyone is. If somebody has wandered off during the day, they're foraging, they spread out over a mile, and some guy took a nap and woke up and he's trying to figure out where everybody is. So he gets up on a rock or he climbs a nearby tree and he gives what is called a wahoo call as follows. Wahoo! Wahoo! And ideally, someone will now answer half a mile away and he knows where they are and goes off, and that's what you do with the wahoo call. So one night I'm camping under the trees there. A lot of the nights you hear fighting, you hear grunting up there, you hear screaming. There's all sorts of social stuff happening up in the trees at night. This particular night happened to be totally quiet. Silence, silence, and suddenly this male up in his perch goes, wahoo, 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 wahoo. He's wahooing his head off in the middle of the night. What the hell is this? And all I could infer was he had a bad dream and woke up and wanted to know if everybody else was still there. Because after about 30 seconds of him doing this, you could hear these disgruntled, okay, yeah, wahoo, wahoo, yeah, we're all here. Go back to sleep, wahoo, yeah, you hear, and I think that was what was going on that evening. So rather than stargazing, they're having scary dreams and social machinations and having babies. And so they turn out to be fairly busy at night.
Wrapping up this episode, Renee from Texas says, we know that COVID can have a wide range of effects on the nervous system as well as other body systems of individuals, but is anyone studying the effects of COVID on a societal level? In what ways might we explain some of the events of the world in light of physical or psychological changes brought on by the pandemic?
Totally interesting subject. And three for three today, a grim one talking about pandemics. Pandemics, we've got COVID, obviously, but there's been no shortage of historical pandemics. There was the Black Plague in the 14th century that killed a third of Europe. London went 300 years afterward before its population returned to what it was pre-plague. There was a 1665 plague outbreak in London. 1793, there was an awful yellow fever outbreak that took down Philadelphia, which was locked down. Of course, there was the 1918 flu, World War I, influenza pandemic. And since then, HIV, and now, of course, COVID. So, what you see, not very surprising to me, is some common themes throughout all of these. First off, in every one of these, the disease hits, the pandemic starts, and the first thing that is done by the powers that be and by the hoi polloi is scapegoat somebody. Black Plague, it obviously was caused by the Jews or the lepers or the Romani, and horrific massacres of populations of all of those who clearly it was their fault that this was going on. In Philadelphia in 1793, during the yellow fever outbreak, there was a population to blame. Haiti had just had a revolution, and a lot of Haitian refugees were coming into the United States, including in Philadelphia. Obviously, it's the Haitians who brought in yellow fever, and we've got to keep these scary immigrants out there. And it's an interesting detail. One of the leading voices for booting the Haitians out and believing that they had started the pandemic was Alexander Hamilton, which I find a little bit puzzling and unsettling. Or maybe Lin-Manuel Miranda didn't really mean it when he was saying, immigrants, we get the job done. Hamilton, an immigrant from the Caribbean himself. So, obvious targets there throughout the 18th century, all sorts of outbreaks. If there was a cholera outbreak, everybody blamed the Irish. Tuberculosis, you blamed the Jews. Typhoid, that was obviously due to, I think, the Irish, Chinese, bubonic plague, Italians, polio, all the usual scapegoating. No support for the notion that any of these populations were disease vectors. 1918, the influenza pandemic, and it was known historically for a long time as the Spanish flu. And the Spaniards had nothing to do with it, and pretty much each European country named the flu after one of their enemies, scapegoating. HIV, when it first roared in the 1980s, again with the Haitians, group that was scapegoated like mad for supposedly being the source of the disease. And that was a problem. And of course, now as we get to COVID, we are 5 years into the then president and now president talking about the origins of the Chinese virus. And scapegoating as a first response there as well. And for outbreaks of horrible Asian persecution, anti-Asian violence in the United States in the last 5 years. So that's a common theme, and that immediately took place. What else immediately takes place in a pandemic? The rich get the hell out of there. COVID, The rich picked up and fled to their private islands and private yachts and got away from all this bother in the Philadelphia yellow fever pandemic. The rich fled town to their second homes, their country homes, 10, 20 miles west of Philadelphia. What's the consequence of that? What we saw with COVID, which is it's disproportionately the poor who are left. And it's disproportionately the poor who have to do things like collect bodies. And people were dropping left and right, people who were working to collect bodies during this yellow fever outbreak. And they sure were not instead getting away to their second homes. What else? Some of the consequences, commonalities, will last for a number of years afterward. And the one that we're already terribly aware of is the disruption due to the pandemic. How bad are the consequences going to be of a number of years of disrupted education for kids, a number of years of disrupted socialization? It remains to be seen. One good thing that seems to come in the years after a pandemic, or at least this was the case in the Black Plague. Yeah, all the wealthy people got out of there that time also, so it was disproportionately the poor living at high densities, terrible hygiene, who were dying left and right. And as the Black Plague ended, as things went back to normal, there was a shortage of peasants. And suddenly, if you were a peasant, you could get paid more to do your work. You could sell your services out. And this apparently played a large role in the beginning of the destruction of the feudal system there, because there weren't enough peasants to go around. And suddenly they had some leverage. So an unexpected thing. Interpretation is for about a century afterward, this demographic effect was felt, increasing the standard of living for the poor peasantry there and collapse of feudal systems. Okay, so that's in the years afterward in those domains. What about health in the years afterward? And here's where we're getting into some very unsettling domains. Much of the research, the most interesting research, has had to do with something called FOAD, FOAD, which I believe we've talked about, fetal origins of adult disease. An entire new field showing prenatal environment, prenatal good news, prenatal bad news can influence health trajectories for the entire lifetime of that fetus afterward. And what people have looked at is, be a fetus during these pandemics, and the consequences are not great. One example of this, 1918 flu, people who were fetuses during the flu pandemic, control groups, people who were fetuses a year before, a year afterward. And what you see is 60 years later, 1980 surveys. This was work carried out by a guy named Caleb Finch, Tuck Finch, USC, wonderful scientist in person. And he showed that if you were a fetus during the flu pandemic, not before, not after, by the time you were 60, 20% increased risk of cardiovascular disease, significantly higher rate of physical disabilities, a long-lasting effect there. What else would you see? You now see something like that playing out for centuries. And here's where I think we may be seeing the most cumulatively consequences of the COVID pandemic. And a lot of this work has been done by a guy, University of British Columbia, named Mark Schaller, who I have to note, he is the son of the greatest living naturalist we have, George Schaller, one of my heroes, who did the first field observations of gorillas in the 1950s, before Goodall, before Fossey. Anyway, this is his son, who's a great researcher, and he's discovered something interesting, which is there's a broad categorization in cross-cultural sociology, psychology, whatever, between cultures that are termed tight cultures and loose ones. Tight cultures, rigid rules as to what behavioral norms are acceptable. intolerant of deviation from that, xenophobia about outsiders, food strictures, ritualistic strictures, strictures on sexual behaviors, uptight societies. Classic tight societies on Earth right now, Singapore, China, places like that. In contrast, loose cultures, the opposite in all those ways, Scandinavia. So this is one of the solid dichotomies, tight cultures versus loose cultures. So research going into what makes for these two different types of cultures, means of living, what type of agriculture, what type of historical governance, and something interesting that pops out there from Schaller's work, looking at 33 different countries, and in a follow-up study, looking at something like 100 indigenous populations from all over the planet, and a simple thing that was measured. How much of an infectious disease load has this country or this indigenous population had in its past? How much has infectious diseases been part of their life? How has it affected mortality? How has it affected infant mortality? And what they have found, and this has been replicated by other people, is lots of a history of infectious disease, and you're more likely to wind up with a tight culture. In addition to the conformity and the rigid rules, in particular, the xenophobia, which makes perfect sense. If infection is wreaking havoc with your world again and again and again, an outsider is a particularly scary individual. Who knows what they're bringing in? Cultures with histories of a lot of epidemics, cultures with histories of being pummeled by infectious diseases over and over, produce xenophobic societies. They don't like outsiders. So what sort of range are we talking about here? And this is where things get extraordinary, because in one of their studies, they show a time interval of 500 years. The infectious disease load in populations, these were some European populations 500 years ago, were predictors of current attitudes towards immigrants, levels of xenophobia. So what are we looking at with COVID? We are looking at consequences for people, 5-year-olds who were fetuses at the time. We're looking at consequences for lifelong health trajectories, this fetal origin of adult disease, and there's an equivalent early childhood trajectories of adult disease. We're looking at effects that could be multi-generational, that could be multi-century. I think what we're seeing is the same grim lesson, which is when one of these things break out, people immediately become very parochial as to who they give a damn about, very narrow windows. They immediately find somebody to scapegoat. The rich get out of there, and the poor pay for it developmentally in terms of educational stuff and health and longevity. And some of these effects last a long, long time. I guarantee you there are people out there who, I don't know, 20, 25 years from now are going to be doing their doctoral dissertations on the health of 30-year-olds who either were or weren't fetuses when COVID hit, compared to just before, compared to a few years afterward. And those people are going to be followed for their lifetime. And the odds are, not because their moms got COVID during pregnancy, but simply because of the massive stress of that period, you are going to see lifelong health consequences. You are going to see lifelong educational consequences of the kids who went through poor schooling and poor socialization during the pandemic. We're going to be seeing this for a long time to come. Now, I grew up with Depression era parents, and there are times where they'd be doing something crazy making, and I'd be tearing my hair out. And I would have this thought, which is, oh, wait, 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 wait. You know, when they were my age, they were going through the Depression. That explains this attitude of theirs, this tendency, whatever. My prediction is about 20 years from now, There's going to be college students who, when they are pulling their hairs out about something crazy making that their 40 something parents are doing to them, they're going to stop and say, oh, yeah, that's right. When my parents were my age, they were going through COVID. That's why they're like that.
And that's episode 89. I'm Offspring Share Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.